Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 245. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about Ukraine and Syria. If you can, support the show by sharing it. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We post a video version on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. You can follow the show on social media at Facebook and Twitter. My Twitter handle is at @KyleAnsloan_. And I also post all the news stories I write there, either for the Libertarian Institute or antiwar.com. And you can support the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Crypto. All that information in the show notes page, as well as the information for our sponsor, Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com, promo code PEACE. Tons of high quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. They put the lab tester results right there on their website. I'm guessing most of my audience is familiar with CBD and, has figured out how it could benefit them for headaches or pain or anxiety, mental health issues, and whether they prefer gummies, soft gels, extracts, topicals like I do. But wherever you got going on, there's something that could help you at Paloma Verde. palomaverdecbd.com, promo code PEACE. Now let's get into the show. All right. Starting off today by talking about the fighting going on in Ukraine, and then we'll slowly kind of zoom out in this war and get into what's happening in the U.S. and how that's going to impact the war. But fighting seems to be most significant right now in the south of the country and the east, particularly in the city of Mariupol, where it's typically home to 400,000. And as of like this week, this past weekend, so Sunday, Monday, there was an estimated 200,000 people trying to get out of that city. It's unclear how many people successfully got out, but it seems that the ceasefire set up to establish a humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol have not been entirely successful. There was an Al Jazeera reporter on the ground who said that he saw some cars get by and everything like that, but fighting restarted, and you need buses to move that many people or some other form of transportation. It's very unlikely that cars are, passenger cars are going to get that many people out of the city that quickly. And it doesn't seem that that is yet happening. And so a lot of people trapped as the fighting is going on. The main story you'll see in the, especially on the mainstream media right now about the Ukraine war, I feel like is in Mariupol, where there was a hospital hit. They're claiming it was a maternity hospital or a children's hospital. This is from the Ukrainian government. I'm not sure. There is some footage that it does seem like, that this is a place where there's medical care going on. So I'm sure it was a hospital. Now, depending on where you're kind of consuming your news, this was either an intentional attack because of Putin's cruelty, or the Russian government is saying that this was no longer a hospital. There was only crisis actors in there, and that the Azov battalion was using the building. Now, likely, as with everything in these war stories, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's probably not that much favoring the narrative that the Russians are putting forward, though, that this probably was some kind of functioning medical facility that was hit by a Russian strike. 17 people injured, no one killed. Very fortunate there. It might not have been intentional on the Russian side, or it could have been intentional because there were like Azov battalion offices, or they are using some other kind of room in that building or facility as like a sniper position. Sometimes rockets miss and our artillery systems, bombs miss and hit the wrong building. These things do happen. And that doesn't excuse it, right? This is what happens when you invade a country. Whenever the U.S. blows up a hospital in the Middle East, very rarely is it intentional that they are hitting a hospital. Now, sometimes they determine that, we saw militants in there, and so we decided to hit it anyways. This was at least one of the stories that came out of the U.S. Attack on the Kunduz hospital in 2015. Saudi Arabia has intentionally bombed cholera treatment facilities in Yemen. So these things do happen. But again, my guess is with the kind of war Russia seems that's trying to wage here, in Ukraine, I don't think that they are trying to necessarily destroy all the civilian infrastructure, and particularly like the children's hospitals and things like that. But again, that doesn't absolve them of it or anything, and they're still responsible. But just, to understand that I think there's a lot of emotional toying going on, particularly in the mainstream media, to make everything happen on the Russian side as they're the absolute biggest devils on the whole planet, and they need to be universally condemned, which is happening quite a bit. Now, the civilian casualty count is up to 549 civilians, and these are confirmed by the UN, including 41 children. So this is, obviously absolutely horrible. The number of children dying, likely, because so much of the fighting is now happening in cities. My guess is we're not seeing like the kinds of deaths of deprivation or anything like we see in Yemen yet. But at the same time, that this could become an issue very quickly if, these cities are besieged and there was no preparation at all for it, which there really doesn't seem to have been. That, these humanitarian situations in these places could get bad quite quickly. You already see, a few hospitals being hit, and this, not healthcare facilities out of service. This is, absolutely terrible. The U.S. is saying Russia has fired over 700 missiles into Ukraine. I don't know. That kind of seems a little high, and my guess would be the U.S. would exaggerate it. And maybe there are some questions as what was maybe fired as air defense, loosely used. If they were like firing them at Ukrainian planes or something like that, that's a little bit different than firing a missile to hit like a target just based on how much damage it's going to cause. Although as we've seen, those anti-aircraft missiles can cause damage to buildings and be problems in cities. And but anyways, that's how that number could get maybe one way. Also, define what between the difference between like artillery and a missile. I'm sure there's like a borderline somewhere where it could, that they could fudge the numbers and make the count look a little bit higher. All the same, that this is a very brutal war that is going on in Ukraine, as we see that, in 2 weeks, this death toll is starting to mount into the hundreds. And again, that is, I think, a pretty conservative number from the UN. They're giving what they could confirm. I guess one thing that, some people are pointing out, and I do think it is worth noting, that as much as the Ukrainian government is arming its civilian population, it may get blurry pretty quick who exactly is a civilian and who's a combatant. If they gave guns to everybody and people started walking around Kiev with an AK-47, does that mean if Russia drops the bomb, all those people are combatants and not civilians? I mean, that's certainly the way that the U.S. has treated things over the, across the Middle East for the past 20 years. But my hope is that it doesn't get counted that way, and we realize that these people are civilians. And even then there is something dark about it. If people are just defending their city and they're shooting out the window of their house, or that they've gone to a blockade that was made by their neighbors a couple blocks over or something like that, and just because they're shooting, I mean, does that really make them not civilians when you're still defending your own home in that much of a literal way? So these numbers are going to get complicated is what I'm saying. But this war is hell. So let's see what else is going on. It doesn't seem that there's really much of a push on the offensive in the city of Kiev. If you watch mainstream media, they kind of claim that it's because the Ukrainian resistance has been so successful. I think maybe some of the more unbiased reporting says that that's just not the area that Russia is pushing right now. It's mostly in the cities in the east and the south. Odessa is another question where there's been reports and reports and reports of Russia encroaching on the city and all of this, but I have not seen a lot of evidence yet of major fighting going on there. But I am just keeping up on that, and it may break out at any time. I kind of suspect that Russia will try to take most of these cities along either the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea. Just strategically, it seems like that would be a way to make sure that weapons are gained into Ukraine by blocking those naval passages. However, I don't know what the Russian strategy is, and I don't think anyone does yet. That's still a major question mark here. So Let's see. Yeah, let's move on and talk about the talks on Thursday that happened in Turkey. Was the Ukrainian foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Apparently, the talks really didn't go anywhere and net anything. I don't know exactly why they weren't more successful or not. Me and Will wrote on the talks happening in Turkey, and that Turkey does have a relationship with both countries, although it is mostly militaristic. But having that bridge maybe was going to facilitate something, but at least yet that doesn't seem to be the case. One interesting change that we have gotten recently on the Ukrainian side is that Zelensky, one of his aides, said Ukraine is open to neutrality but won't cede territory. So this is some good news that they're willing to look at neutrality, because I don't think that Russia would end this invasion without Ukrainian neutrality. I also think Russia is going to demand that and really force the issue on the Donbass and Crimea. The reason for that is if Ukraine drops those land claims, it's going to be harder, I think, for the West, at least in the long term, to continue their hostilities and their demands that be returned to Ukraine. So I do think Russia is going to push hard on those issues. Now, I have seen a couple statements recently from Russia that seems that they've flexed a little bit on the demilitarize issue, and again, I'm guessing this is going to be some kind of scale. Not that they're not going to take every AK-47 out of Ukraine or anything like that. But at the same time, my guess is they're not going to be able to get any weapons from NATO countries, or this is going to be part of the demands. And then it doesn't seem that they're pushing the denazify as much, which I think is good news. Again, that was one of the top concerns for me, is this denazify issue is actually going to turn more into an excuse for Russia to carry out different kinds of crimes, whether political purges or military war crimes in Ukraine. There's a report that Russia is using cluster munitions. All the footage I've looked at does not seem to me to definitely say that Russia is using it. There's been times where they've took pictures of fragments of parts that appear to be parts of Russian cluster munitions, so this could be the case. However, I don't know enough to make the call on that, and these pictures could turn up from different places, so I place a heavy skepticism on that claim, but it is possible. And then the videos that I've seen claiming it just don't seem to be true. It seems like they're just rocket strikes to me. All right, and then the thermo bombs. It does seem that are the vacuum bombs, depending on how they want to phrase it. But these, I guess, burn so hot in the air that it's going to, deprive people on the ground of air. And this is a particularly horrible weapon. And it does appear that Russia has been using that in Ukraine, but no official confirmation on that yet, but there does seem to be some pretty strong evidence of that claim, and this could be contributing to the civilian casualties. All right, so that is, I think, of what I have about fighting going on actually in Ukraine, and now I want to move out a little bit further and talk about this congressional hearing where Marco Rubio asked Victoria Nuland about the chemical weapons labs in our chemical and biological research centers or labs in Ukraine, where Nuland actually said that the U.S. was concerned about Russia gaining control of these. And so there's a great article by Glenn Greenwald on this. It's the Spotlight today at antiwar.com, where Greenwald argues that, hey, listen, this seems like a real admission. Rubio seemed to be asking her to debunk the Russians, what they have been saying, which is that, these labs were a real concern about them. And here you have Nuland saying that it's actually a concern. Then you had White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that to be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine, or to create a false flag operation using them. And so it's It's interesting what's going on here. I guess I want to be very careful with these claims because they seem to be originating from the Russian government around the time of invasion. So it just could have been, you know, more excuses, right? Weapons of mass destruction, except in Ukraine. But, because they also made claims on the nuclear issue as well. However, this admission from Newland certainly suggests that there's something here that deserves to be looked at, and the fact that the U.S. is saying that they're, could potentially use chemical or biological weapons is a little bit concerning because I guess, Russia probably does have their own programs, and so the U.S. could be talking about that. But if we are, talking about what's coming out of these labs, if they are already in a state to be used for chemical or biological warfare, then maybe the U.S. was working with Ukraine in these kinds of facilities. There's, I think, a report from China that the U.S. had 26 of them that it was funding in Ukraine. And so it could be interesting to see how this develops, how Russia is going, because they've also claimed that Ukraine was going to make nuclear weapons, and that's one of the reasons they had to take the nuclear sites. And so I'm not sure if Russia is going to maybe invite international UN inspectors, maybe from the OPCW or the IAEA. They investigate. OPCW is chemical weapons, the IAEA is nuclear weapons or just nuclear technology in general. And maybe they would invite them to come in and look around, and maybe we get some kind of report that isn't from Russia on it, or international journalists or something like that to look at this. But if it's only coming out of the Russian side, there's rightfully a lot of skepticism to it. Again, it's gained interesting because we now have some emissions on it from the Americans. All right. Want to mention here that Venezuela released two Americans, one a Citgo executive and one a Cuban American tourist who was arrested in Venezuela. And they say that there are more talks between the U.S. and Venezuela to come. These talks are originating and happening because the U.S. is, trying to end all of its imports of Iranian or of Russian oil, and so in doing so, that they're seeking a deal with the Venezuelans to get access to some more of Venezuela's oil after the U.S. Execute a maximum pressure sanctions campaign on Venezuela during the Trump administration. All right, now I want to get into this story around the Polish MiDs. These are MiG 29 warplanes that are used by the Ukrainian Air Force. And so there's been an idea floated, at least for the past week. I don't know how clandestinely versus how overtly this was meant to play out. But the idea was that the U.S. would supply Poland with new American made warplanes, or at least American made warplanes, if Poland were to donate, I believe they're 29 MiDs to the Ukrainian Air Force. And so it kind of seemed like this wasn't happening after the initial reports that, that they had talked about this. All the countries involved quickly said, no, we're not going to do it. And then on the Sunday talk show, I forget, maybe Face the Nation, I think Margaret Brennan was interviewing Antony Blinken, and he said that the U.S. had green lighted the plan. Now, I have no idea why Blinken said this, because it seems that the Pentagon is not on board. With the Pentagon now saying there's no way it's going to happen. This is even after the Poland said, well, we're going to transfer all of our MiDs to the airbase in Germany, and then the U.S. could do what they want with them. My sense is that Poland is really just trying to get some new planes out of this, and that's why they're pushing the deal so hard. It seems like a great way to get a bunch of free money and free warplanes from the United States, replace it with some new ones. Because as the Pentagon says, there's little operational advantage to carrying out this kind of attack anyways. So let's see, what else do I want to talk about here? We have the U.S. spending bill. It's going to be $1.5 trillion to fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year. That runs through the end of September. And this bill is going to end up with defense spending being at $782 billion. as much as the next 11 countries combined. It's going to add a dozen new F-18 Super Hornets, 5 Reaper drones, a CH-53K King Stallion heavy lift helicopter, and engines for the F-35. It's also going to give more money to the submarine industry to be able to pump out more submarines. It includes funding for an Arleigh Clark Burke class destroyer, 3 littoral combat ships, 2 expeditionary fast transport ships, and $775 million for an additional John Lewis class fleet oiler. So, this is a massive amount of money for the military that we're talking about here. And while Congress went ahead and stripped, I think, like $15 billion in COVID relief funds from the bill, they also approved into the bill $14 billion that's been called the Ukrainian aid package, although a lot of that money is just going to go towards the Pentagon and troops in Eastern Europe. And so it really has nothing to do with Ukraine. But at least 7.5 million will actually go towards Kiev, with 3.5 billion for weapons and 4 billion for humanitarian efforts. So that's, I believe, most of what's in the bill there. Of course, most of the important defense spending stuff and everything to do with Ukraine is all that. Let's see. Also want to mention here that the U.S. has increased its intelligence sharing with Ukraine. This from Day to Camp. The White House modified rules to expand intelligence sharing with the Ukrainian government to help Ukraine fight Russia, the Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday. Unnamed U.S. officials told the Journal that the White House made the move last week after complaints from both Democrats and Republicans in Congress that the Biden administration wasn't sharing real-time targeting data that would help Ukraine strike Russian armored formations. The plan allows the Pentagon and U.S. spy agencies to share information with Ukraine with less bureaucratic red tape. We're adjusting as circumstances warrant and will continue to ensure that operations have flexibility to share intelligence as the conflict evolved, U.S. intelligence officials said. So, the U.S. is very involved in this war with the amount of military aid that we're giving Ukraine. Even if we back off on transferring over the MIDs, this is still very serious. There's a lot of people in the U.S. calling for a no-fly zone. I think like 70% of Americans. Look, even Marco Rubio and Chris Murphy don't want to do this. And so I'm not going to get in a long argument about why the no-fly zone is stupid on this show. But I've certainly talked about it in the past. And then, something else interesting on intelligence. Apparently, the Ukrainian government is looking to move all of their intelligence out of the country. This as Russia is encroaching on Kiev. And so I guess there's a lot of data, and who knows who's going to end up getting access to this. If you bring it over to a NATO member state, they may mine it all too. This could be very dangerous for the Ukrainians here. All right, so I want to take a second to talk about another part of the war here, and that's just the like emotional nature that's being aspect of it that's being pushed on us, and the consequences of that. And so, first of all, while this war is terrible, as I don't want to pull back on, there's 1 million plus people now. I think 1 million children now that have had to leave their homes. There's been critical infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, things like that damaged. This I don't think has really improved the situation for Russia so far, security wise, and who knows how this ends up playing out. But it could be really nasty for years to come. But even the war as it is not a good thing. Now, as I've always said, there's been war going on in Ukraine for 8 years. 14,000 people have died in that war. Who knows exactly what the death toll is when all is said and done here. Again, the confirmed civilian death toll is 549. There's been thousands of dead soldiers. I'm pretty sure on each side. I think the Russian count is still around 500. That's the number they're putting out. My guess is that it's higher than what the Russian government is saying at this point, that they're trying to downplay those numbers as much as possible. And of course, people will succumb to injury as time goes on. So, this is horrible, and maybe it's not quite yet the same death toll as that 8 year long war, but this has only been going on for 2 weeks, and so it's been pretty devastating 2 weeks for Ukraine, and I really am trying, very hard not to downplay that, but at the same time, also not just drive so hard home on this that it loses the context of where this ranks in the current wars that the U.S. is waging, like in Yemen, like in Syria, where the U.S. is preventing that country from being rebuilt after 10 years of war now. In Yemen, a deliberate starvation campaign. The same thing in Afghanistan held this winter. Why nobody is paying attention, while everybody isn't paying attention to the thousands that are dying in Ukraine. We could lose over 100,000 people in Afghanistan because of Joe Biden's economic war on that country. And so, I'm trying to in some way like keep that balance and talk about this as horrible as it is, but then also remind people of the perspective, and this is so important in other ways too, like talking about how Palestinians are treated compared to Ukrainians, where you have Palestinian children killed this week by Israeli forces, that are funded to the tune of $4 billion a year by the U.S. government, right? Those Israeli forces that are occupying Palestinian lands and killing Palestinians. That they're killing them for throwing Molotov cocktails, but at the same time, when it's the Ukrainians throwing the Molotov cocktails at evading Russian forces, those people are heroes, and it's just it doesn't feel right at all that dichotomy and is allowed to exist and should be called out every time. And so, I'm absolutely disgusted by that. And I think that if anything, that the Palestinians have, suffered far more, and, quite understandably at this point are out in the streets throwing the Molotov cocktails at the people who have invaded them for 70 years. Not that the Ukrainian resistance isn't justified at all, but just if you look at what happened, the pain that the Palestinians have been through, the Nakba, the fact that they live under an apartheid regime and have done so for decades, you understand that resistance very easily. And while I never am like a fan of violence myself, definitely understand why the Palestinians are carrying out those kinds of attacks, and yet it's called terrorism on one side and it's praised as heroism on the other. There has to be some kind of balance and some kind of discussion. And again, especially as the Palestinians tried nonviolent resistance for years to occupation, and are often met just things that are mildly violent, like throwing a rock at a soldier, is met with violent force from the other side, and even sometimes less just straight up peaceful means protests are treated violently by the Israelis. And so just want to say all that stuff. One other thing news story that I thought was interesting, that Lithuania won't be donating COVID vaccines to Bangladesh because Bangladesh won't condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that just kind of gets into this whole thing where everybody has to come out and condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it has to say it's awful, but there's no standard on this with Israel, right? You actually have one of the richest Russians that he owns the Chelsea soccer team and Millhouse Capital, and he supports with hundreds of millions of dollars the Israeli settlements, the Israeli violent occupation, the dispossession of Palestinian lands. He's making that happen with his money, and nobody ever complains. He's the owner of the football team. People like him. And then just because now that he's Russian, they are sanctioning him and taking the football team away from him. And so again, it's not necessarily that I think that this guy should maybe own the team. Like if I were a fan, I guess I would feel kind of disgusted that my team ownership is donating hundreds of millions of the dollars of the team I love to kick Palestinians off of their land, but that you just react so hard on something that just because he's Russian, and there's been vandalization of Russian like institutions in West, and all this is very disgusting. The only thing I could compare it to, the only thing that I've experienced that is even close to the emotional hatred by people in the West for Russia right now, is how people felt about Arabs after 9/11. And I mean, that's a really concerning thing to say, because things got very nasty after 9/11. People killing them, and of course everybody being okay with opening a torture prison for Muslims and things like that. And I would hope that we don't go like to World War II thing and start just interning Russians writ large. But the fact that there's like this obligation for any Russian existing in whatsoever, the American Western, like, a little bit more cultural popular sphere, like if you're a musician or a gymnast or something, like there's like an obligation that you denounce the Russian invasion. And again, there's no obligation on this for anybody to denounce the occupation of Israel, even though the American government funds that with hundreds of billions of dollars, or the war in Yemen. If I were to like just go out on the street and ask Americans, like, do you condemn what the Americans are doing in Yemen, I would be looked at like a lunatic. And like, if I directed it at like a different country, like, I don't know, like if I were out on the street asking Ugandans if they condemn the Ugandan government invading the Congo or something like that, I'm pretty sure that I would be called a racist. And so to do this, just keep that in mind when you're doing this to Russian people and banning Russian vodka and all this other crazy stuff that's going on. All right, now let's talk about Syria, where Israel says there have been no disruptions to their campaign, their bombing campaign in Syria, despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At first, Israel was concerned that the Russian invasion would cause enough of a rift between Russia and America that would make it harder for Israel to continue to bomb Syria, because Syria is a Russian ally. But Israel said their deconfliction, I guess, channels and everything are still open. The bombing campaigns are continuing. They killed 2 civilians in the past weekend. Iran reports they killed 2 members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Iran does say they are going to respond to Israel for killing the 2 members of the IRGC, which, comes at an interesting time. As Connor Freeman was breaking down the last show, we're almost here at the point where we're about to get back into maybe potentially the Iran nuclear deal, right? This would be absolutely huge. It would take the prospect of war between Iran and Russia off the table. And here we have Israel making threats, saying the whole world needs to mobilize against Iran, killing Iranian soldiers in Syria, and then Iran now making counter threats. It's I guess unclear how quick Iran would plan to act here, and if they would get involved on a short enough timeline that it could actually mess up the potential return to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. But it is a potential threat to the deal, the conflict going on in Syria. Also, of course, this kind of like the war in general, where Russia is a party to all of this, the JCPOA and the Syrian civil war. The war in Ukraine certainly could play a geopolitical factor in what happens in Syria, in the years to come. My guess would be that, Ukraine would be like a higher geopolitical concern than Syria, particularly, as long as Assad is firmly in control of Syria and the Russian bases aren't threatened. Let's see. We have the Islamic State killing 15 Syrian soldiers in central Syria. And let's see. We have quite a few casualties happening in Syria. Around, there's some fighting going around Idlib. Of course, in western Syria, there's some fighting going on. And then the 15 soldiers killed and the people killed in the Israeli airstrikes. And so, this is still a war zone in Syria. And while the bombing in Syria may not have been as intense over the past couple of weeks as it has been in Ukraine, nonetheless, the people there are still suffering. And the fact that they suffered for years under extremely heavy bombing campaigns. You look, entire cities almost reduced to rubble, and yet the U.S. is actively preventing any rebuilding funds from getting into that country. There's babies freezing to death in the Idlib province and other areas of Syria because, again, just there's no money there. There's no opportunity. People are just, existing on the bare minimum of aid that they're allowed to get, and it's not enough to keep all the babies alive, and so they're dying. And the U.S. could really improve the situation in Syria by removing the sanctions, by removing our forces from Syria, maybe on the way out helping the Kurds to negotiate some kind of understanding with the Assad government so conflict doesn't have to break out there. help the Kurds get a little bit of autonomy, and then, allow Syria to maybe access some of the oil and the wheat and stuff like that in that area of the country to feed the people who are starving to death and the rest of it. And then once trade opens up and aid could get back in, this will be key for Syria being able to rebuild. And even if it does mean that Assad gets a little bit of money out of it or something like that, I much rather, Assad get some money than have the American sanctions starving poor little babies to death all over the world, including in Syria. Yeah, so I think that's what I got for the show today. I hope everybody's enjoying the coverage on the Russia stuff. I'm trying to provide a lot of nuance to it. I feel like everybody is just very reactionary on this, and I get it. You have the U.S. who have been the biggest monsters in the whole world, just going around. The U.S. war has been slaughtering millions of people, and now that Russia is killing a few hundred or a few thousand, everybody is losing their minds, and it is in a way intolerable. At the same time, this is a very important thing that we're covering because it could potentially pit the U.S. against Russia, and because civilians are dying and people's lives are being ruined, and it's never going to be the same for a lot of people in Ukraine. By the time things get rebuilt, the fact that that a lot of children have been traumatized and things like that, these things don't go away. And so even if this war isn't quite as bad as what's happening in Yemen, it's still really bad, still worth condemning, and of course covering and talking about. But particularly I want to cover a lot on the show because the potential conflict between the U.S. and Russia. And at the same time, just because this is a war that's been aggressively waged by Russia, to continue to provide the context, the nuance of all of this, and not just, it's the every Russia bad thing that comes out of the media and every Ukraine good thing that comes out of the media. Also, not to reduce the whole conversation to neo-Nazis, because while it is an important factor, it isn't everything in this war. All right. Anyways, that's where I'm wrapping up. Hope everybody's enjoying the show, and I'll see you next week.